Greetings, everyone. This is Tanya. This is a presentation on local wild edible and medicinal plants in the Washington, D.C. area. This is part one of a two-part program that was put together in the spring of 2022. So please do check out part two. And before we get started, there's a disclaimer. I, Tanya Bucci, am not responsible for any injuries or illnesses that result from your actions. You are responsible to do your own research and most importantly, use your common sense. This information is brought to you solely as an educational guide with the best of intention. It is imperative to always properly identify a plant before you even touch it, let alone consume it. Use this information along with quality field guides, other reliable sources, and or a knowledgeable forager to assist you. Never rely on any one source when foraging for wild plants. Also, do a field edibility safety test. And also, I do recommend learning as many poisonous plants as possible. You do not want to be digging your wild edibles from a place where there's poisonous growing nearby. Okay? Here are some field guides that you might be interested in checking out. And also, I do have an ebook, so if you're interested in that, please let me know. Dandelion, this is very, very common. Most people are very familiar with it. There's a lot of uses for it. This is something, honestly, it's just not just for a survival situation on what to eat. This is something you should eat probably all the time. It is free food, it's available, and it's extremely nutritious. You've got to think about the food that comes from, California or wherever. We don't know what it was sprayed with. There's a lot of things coming out with the organic. Some things that were approved for organic farming aren't so necessarily healthy. So, keep those things in mind. Take that with a grain of, dulse, and then go from there. Anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about how we can eat the dandelions. All parts are edible. Of course, you're not going to have the seed pods and things of that nature. But what you can have is the leaves. You can have them raw as a salad green. They're especially less bitter before the flower occurs, but they're still edible after that. It's just a choice of what your palatability level is with bitter foods. And anyway, steamed, sauteed, juiced, blended, just like you would have any other leafy green. The roots can be boiled as a vegetable. The roots can be roasted, ground as a coffee substitute. The flowers make really nice fritters. And what I mean by fritters, if you're not familiar, is you take the flower heads, take as much as the green bract off, the components, it's a modified leaf that wraps around the flower head. Remove as much of that as possible because that's going to give bitterness to your fritters. You kind of want something that's more milder in flavor. And anyway, then you dip them in like a batter that you make out of cornmeal or flour or something, maybe if you can get, something out beyond that, depending on what you use. And then you dip them and then you fry them. I get tired of dipping, so after a while I just dump all my flour heads into my batter, stir it up, and then just scoop it out and make pancakes. And I prefer that method because of efficiency, but you can do with it what you will. And also, you can also eat them raw. You can put them on salads, make them like your salads really pretty, or garnish your soups, especially, as the temperature warms up, we might want cooler soups, and they do really well on that. And you can take the flowers and make them into wine. I've never done that, so I can't speak on how that's done. So maybe somebody can enlighten other people about that. And medicinally, this is one of the plants that are extremely detoxifying to the body. So we do need to kind of do some spring cleaning every year. We should probably be doing it a little bit more regularly considering how many toxins we are exposed to, but that's a topic for another day. The leaves are diuretic. They help stimulate appetite. They increase bowel production. We need that to help digest foods, especially fats. And the flower is an antioxidant. The root, you can either, make a tea where you're boiling it. That's called a decoction, or a tincture, which is a topic for another time. But I do have a video on that does talk about how to make a tincture. So you can check that out in the playlist. Detoxification, especially for the liver and the gallbladder, definitely important. It's also good for your kidneys. The stems, it has a milky latex. You can use that to treat warts, skin eruptions. In the bush, you can use it for glue, but it's not the best, glue. There's definitely other plants and trees that are better than dandelion, but it can be used, and it's high in vitamins and minerals. Now we have the false dandelions and the true dandelion. Okay, there's a lot of different types of dandelions that are actually in that genus. But that being said, we're talking about the official dandelion, the common dandelion. This is actually the reason when they used that in the botanical name is because that was the one that was used, historically for medicine. We have to realize that before the 20th century, before the 1900s, if you remember those, Seems like a long time ago. That, you know, in the 1800s, there was no, you know, pharmaceutical medicines as we have them today. So people, you've relied on plants and trees and stuff for their medicine. And, you know, these are still available today. So keep those things in mind. Anyway, on the left side here, we have Harry's cat's ear. It's also known as a false dandelion. And it is not going to harm you. You can't eat this. It's not very palatable because of all the hair. There's also a smooth cat's ear, but that is not as common. The both of them are introduced, but this one has taken over a little bit more and spread than the smooth, which is unfortunate because, you know, palatability, the hairy isn't as good. Of course, you can still eat the leaves. I just really wouldn't recommend them raw because that's not very palatable. But again, that's a matter of taste. And I do want to just talk about colt's foot is on the left-hand side. It's in the same family of the dandelions. Now, it's not poisonous in the way that we would think about water hemlocks or poison hemlock. You know, it's not going to send you to the ER and, you know, result in death and possible, you know, things of that nature. But it is toxic over the long term. It does have cancer-causing properties, and it has compounds that are toxic to the liver. So we don't want to be introducing, you know, those things into our body. But again, there's a lot of sources that say that it's edible because technically, I mean, it won't kill you immediately. And they have eaten it for long periods of time. It is actually used in a confectionery candy in England, but now they have actually made a cultivated version of colt's foot in the lab that actually doesn't have those negative compounds in it, the toxic compounds. But when you're finding things that are growing in the wild around here, it's going to be the wild plant and it's still going to have those compounds. Okay, these are just some illustrations of those, so just that way you can get more familiar with the dandelions. And again, I don't think I really went over it too much, but let me just go back to the illustrations. What is the difference between the cat's ear and the dandelion is that you have, on the dandelion, you will have a stem and one flower head. You'll have possibly another stem, one flower head. It will not branch into multiple flower heads on the same plant. Now, on cat's ear and some hawkweeds, hawkbeards, they also have similar flowers that, you know, to the dandelion. What you're going to have is a branching. So you'll have a stem that comes up and it'll branch off. So you see here, it's branching off into multiple flower heads. You will never see that on a dandelion. So those are what you're going to be looking from. You will also find no leaves on that stem. It'll come up out of a basal rosette. Basal rosette means just round. Rosette means, you know, round like that. And it'll come up, okay? So oftentimes with other plants, that's not what you'll see. So there's just help you differentiate those. This just talks about the edible medicinal uses of the cat's ear, very similar to dandelion, just milder action medicinally. And we've talked about how you can eat it in similar fashion. Next up, we have cattails. Cattails is something good to know. I do want to preface this with a warning and say, please do not eat it raw out of water. I would say all water is sketchy at best. You need to purify it in some way before you drink it and also before you consume anything out of it. That being said, there's ways to purify it. You can cook your food, you know, heat will destroy a lot of pathogens. Also, you can use things like food-grade hydrogen peroxide and SoCure, things that are in water that will kill pathogens as well. It does take a little bit of time. You have to soak for a while. Also, salt does have some benefit in killing things as well. But again, you can't just dip and go. You need to soak for some length of time and make sure that concentration is high enough. Anyway, that's, you know, ask me any questions about that if you have any, and you can reach out to me. We can talk more about it. Let's talk more about cattails. So this is something that you'll find growing in around wetlands. So around ponds, along streams, it's more like they like sitting water, you know, it's not necessarily, you're not going to see this growing like, you know, along like a river. They like a different type of environment. So think of swamps, ponds, ditches, you know, things of that nature is where you're going to find this. So what's nice about the cattails is we have two varieties that are very common. You can use them interchangeably, no big deal. The narrow leaf is going to have a very noticeable separation between the male and the female parts, whereas the broadleaf, they are actually adjacent. Does that matter? No, not at all. You can consume them anyway. It's just for if you were interested in how to know the difference. Now you know. Now this is going to flower May through July. That's important to know because one of the best things we can get from this is the pollen. You can eat this raw, or you can collect it in a baggie, a clean bag, and use it as a flower extender, add it to baked goods, add it to your oatmeal, extra nutrients, and that's going to help with some of the things. So you can add it to some of the foods that you have if you're out camping. Also, whenever we have the young, where it's like brown and it hasn't gone to fluff, these are whenever you can actually grill these up. I would take the pollen off this before I would grill it up. You wouldn't want to waste that. And then grill them up, eat it like corn on the cob. Now, obviously, when it goes to seed like this and goes into a fluff, has other uses, edibility not being one of them. But what you can do with this is you can make a nice flash tinder, and you can also use the dried stalks of this that will persist through the winter into the spring for kindling as well. But the area that we need to really think about getting this, obviously you don't have to worry about cleaning this if you're obviously getting the top parts, okay? Collecting the pollen, you don't have to, soak that or anything. I ate that right off of the thing. It's not growing directly in contact with the water. Now, where you do need to be concerned with is the rhizome. Now, that's the rootstock. And think, if you're unfamiliar with what a rhizome is, just think about ginger root, turmeric, something like that. That's what we're speaking about. And out in the wild, if you eat a lot of leafy greens or whatever, you're not going to get a lot of calories. They're not very energy dense. They're nutrient dense, but not energy dense. Whereas this is very, it has high nutrients, but it's very energy dense. So you got a lot of calories. Now, unfortunately, it's not like a tuber that you can just, kind of grill up and eat, like we would do, say, a carrot or beets. So to get that starch out of there, you actually have to pound it out of that fibrous rhizome. So you can take it in a pot, if you're out in the wild, use a rock or something like that. Again, we're going to cook this, so this is something that you're not going to eat raw. So keep those things in mind as well. And anyway, you want to separate that starch out from those fibers. Then take the fibers out of the water, let the water and the starch separate. The starches are more dense than the water, so they will sink to the bottom in time. Then you can pour the water off. Now you can take that and utilize it right then and there by adding it to your baked goods, keeping in mind you already have a high moisture content, so whatever liquid you would be adding to your recipe would be decreased. But you can also dehydrate this for long-term use, so it's up to you on that. Also, the young leaves and shoots can be steamed. As they get older, they become too fibrous to be used, but at that point, you can still use the leaves to wrap a bandage, small wounds, use it as a tourniquet as well, so that definitely has a lot of uses. Again, we spoke about the pollen. We talked about the catkins. You can eat them, again, when they're immature green up to mature, obviously before they go to seed. They get all fluffy and stuff. That would be quite awful. Anyway, the rhizome, you can also use it as, pound that out, make a poultice out of it. That's for external use, and you apply that to treat burns, scrapes, insect bites, bruises, etc. The liquid in the stem you can use for wounds. It's anti-inflammatory, antibacterial. Speaking about antibacterial, now when you're dealing with the stem, make sure it's up out of the water, because you really don't want to be infecting yourself with pathogens when you're trying to get rid of those. And the old fiber stock we talked about, it can be used for the fire, but it can also be used for cordage as well. I do want to warn people is this isn't as common, but it does exist, and oftentimes you may find this. I don't want to say often, it depends. Is the blue flag iris. Do not consume this. Make sure you know the difference. This does grow a lot different, and maybe if and the way that obviously the flowers, it's obviously much more low growing, but it could be growing alongside. It's not going to be growing in the water so much like you would find the cattails, but it could be right along the marshlands and things like that. This is poisonous. Do not consume it. And it's a very interesting plant, because when you look down on it, it'll grow kind of flatter. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And obviously, it's very low growing in comparison to the cattails, which are going to be extremely high. The major concern is in the early spring with the shoots that you might get them confused. Keep in mind with cattails, last year's growth is going to be right there. So you should be seeing, dead stalks of cattails and you should see the shoots coming right up out of those. So it's not like you're going to just see randomly some shoots coming up without the old growth there. Okay? So, but anyway, do keep this in mind. Don't consume it, and just observe it. Very beautiful, but it is extremely toxic. The sap can also cause dermatitis. So don't be making poultices out of this or wrapping any wounds with it. Now the iris has been used as a magical plant, and I have no knowledge of magic, so I can't speak on that, but I have read that, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And also there is historical use for medicinal purposes. But again, the Peterson's Field Guide is great, but a lot of times they'll talk about historical use. But again, what were the outcomes of that? They may have used it, but successfully? I don't know. So this is something I consider poisonous, and I would not use for anything. Okay? Next up, we have wild garlic, spawn onions, and also you might find chives out there. We talk about ramps, but that's in part 2, so if you're interested, it's also in the same genus, but it is a little bit different as far as the way, of course, that they look. And so this is what they look like when they flower. We have a lot of different varieties around here of wild garlics, wild onions. Knowing necessarily the difference in the names is not very important. Of course, we do have chives here that's on the right, and I would say the left, that's probably wild garlic. And I definitely know that here on the right is a nodding onion, and here is probably onion or garlic. I don't know. You would have to really, honestly, some are hollow, some are not. And also, here is the problem. Some people call the same exact plant wild onion, and another person calls it wild garlic, even though it's the same one. So it's colloquially, they're used interchangeably. I don't really concern myself with the differences. They're all edible. And it's what you can find. Keep in mind, do not get these confused with grasses. Don't get them confused with the death camas. Don't get them confused with anything like that. You want a plant that when you crush it, it smells like an onion or wild garlic. Keep in mind, some of the plants you don't want to be crushing with your hands. So I do recommend, if you're unsure and you want to crush a plant to kind of see what it smells like, use a rock or a stick and then smell it. Don't use your hands, because some plants do cause dermatitis. Some plants are toxic and some, and poisonous. So you don't want to do that. Anyway, if you've identified it as wild garlic and a wild onion, you can use the leaf just like you would chives, or the wild onions you buy at the store. Chop them up. You can eat them raw in salads, on sandwiches, garnish on potatoes, beans, meat, etc. Okay, cook it like a green. And as well, if that's what you're into, bulbs you can boil, pickle, add them raw to salads. The green bulbets, and I'm talking about the flower heads we saw at the beginning, you can pickle them after the flower appears, so there's little things that remain. They're really interesting. And medicinally, we're talking garlics and wild onion. We know they're high in antioxidants. We know they're high in vitamin C. We know they're good for our immune system. That has been proven scientifically. So we can use them to treat colds and flus, poultices. People use it to apply to the chest for respiratory conditions. Juice in the oil used for earaches. Still used today. You can buy that at Whole Foods. They have a garlic oil and they have a mullein oil. So very common. You can also make it yourself. Antifungal, antiparasitic, as all garlics are. A word of note with garlics, especially, is that consuming high amounts of them may affect blood clotting. Means it'll thin your blood. So if you're on anticoagulants, this might not be something you want to consume a lot of. That's just something you might want to check with your doctor. Another plant that smells like garlic, has a flavor of garlic, but isn't even in the family, is garlic mustard. This is actually a crucifer. When we talk about crucifers, what I'm talking about is that name comes from cross. Okay? So when we look at plants in this family, they are all going to have 4 petaled flowers in a cross shape, okay? That's one way you can do it, and also the number of stamens, but then you got to get down and look. And also the seed pods are going to be very definitive here as well. Think about mustard. You might have consumed that, even today. Many people do. It's going to come from the seeds. So you can use the seeds from the garlic mustard to make mustard if you so choose. And also horseradish, which you might be familiar with, it is in the same family as well. So you can use the roots here as a substitute for that. Now, garlic mustard is a biennial. So this is a first year growth. As you can see, the leaves are quite shaped differently. They become much more triangular in the second year. I do recommend eating it in the second year. In the first year, Plant has larger amounts of phytochemicals. We have to think about plants. They can't get up and run from predators. They can't get up and run from bugs that are trying to eat it or animals. And they're trying to survive just like we are, just like the animals. So they do have compounds in it, chemicals that protect them from the environment, from predators, from molds, from fungi, things of that nature. Well, some of those compounds are good for us and some of them are not. In the first year, it has a higher amount of compounds in it that aren't so good for us. But in the second year, it's made it through the winter. It's en route. It's getting ready to go to seed, which it will literally do very early on. This is something you can expect to see. It's been a cold spring, but typically by April, I'm not so certain now considering it is April and we had snow today. But into May, maybe into early June this year, I would expect things to go into early June because of the cold weather. And the other great thing about garlic mustard, it's absolutely delicious for one, but it is invasive. So you can eat this like as much as you want. You cannot harm it. In fact, you not eating it is harming the environment. So do the world a favor and eat as much of it as you possibly can. When I go out hiking, say in parks and whatnot, and I see these flower heads, I just snip them and eat them as a trailside nibble, and that prevents it from going to seed. Get the tops off, and it's delicious, and it helps it from spreading. So these are things, I like doing that better than the people that I've seen, just rip it up and leave it on the trail. That's kind of ugly and nasty. It will die down. It's biennial. It is not a perennial, so you just need to get it from going to seed. That'll stop its spread, okay? The leaves, stems, and flowers, great addition to your salad, sandwiches, steamed, sauteed, juiced, blended in smoothies. You can eat it raw. You can use it in lieu of parsley to make a pesto. Add it with some, garlic. And this also has the garlic in it, so it's actually serving double duty there. Now the roots, we talked about how you can use it as a substitute for horseradish. The seeds, again, you can use it just like a seasoning as you would any other mustards for the seeds. It does have disinfectant properties and it's a diuretic. Diuretic just means that helps your kidneys operate as they should. The one note with crucifers, and this goes for kale, broccoli, cabbage, beyond just the wild foods, they are goitrogenic, which means they disrupt thyroid hormones by interfering with iodine uptake. So how we can mitigate that is we can eat raw in moderation. And if you're going to eat more, definitely I would say cook it, steam it. That's going to help reduce those compounds that are in it. And the other way you can also help, since it's interfering with iodine uptake, increase your iodine consumption. How you can do that very easily, you can get dulse sprinkles, or kelp sprinkles. They're really nice and they add a lot of flavor and a lot of minerals. They're high in iodine. That way you're offsetting those and getting extra nutrition as well. And again, we talked about how it's best to consume the leaves early in the second year if eating raw, and obviously there's no flowers in the first year. Okay, another plant that's in the crucifer family, so what we spoke about with goitrogens is going to apply here, and it's going to apply for a lot of the ones we talk about in this presentation, because there's a lot of crucifers that's growing, especially in the early spring, is Dame's Rocket. So what's interesting about Dame's Rocket, it's an invasive, so you can eat as much of it as you want. It is definitely kind of taking over. It's very beautiful, but it is not something you want to crowd out all the native species. And that said, the flowers range from white, pink, to purple. Pink, I guess that's more lavender, if you will. And however you want to look at that. So it's quite beautiful. The palatability isn't as good in my opinion, as the garlic mustard because there's a lot of hair on this. Some of the, wherever you get it, is going to have more hair. I mean, hair keeps plants warm. So I've seen Dame's Rocket with, minimal amount to being extremely hairy. So there is variability there. That being said, it does have a lot of seed pods, which are, again, you're going to get the mustard seeds, and you can utilize all parts of it. Now, the other thing about broccoli and about the crucifers, they are high in compounds that help in detoxification and are anti-tumor. That's been proven scientifically. And it's especially concentrated in the sprouts. So, if you got the seeds, you could sprout those and make, instead of broccoli seed sprouts, you could have Dame's Rockets sprouts. So that's just something interesting. And the more seeds you don't let out into the wild to where it's going to keep spreading, the more it'll help the native plants. Okay. Now, the one nice thing about Dame's Rocket is the flower buds are, pretty large. We saw right back here. So before they come out and before the buds are, you can actually chop off the top portion of the plant, 4 inches, and then you can dip that into some sort of batter, or you can just saute it with some butter and some salt, maybe some pepper as well, whatever your seasoning preferences are. So, and this is also biennial, so you are going to see the low-growing rosette type of growth pattern in the first year, and then in the second year, it is going to bolt up, and then it's going to flower. You're going to see this about the same time as the garlic mustard. It's a little just maybe 2 weeks delayed past the garlic mustard, but you'll see them at the same time. Now, another one that you will see early on in the spring is the Eastern Redbud. This is a tree, and it's a very beautiful one. It's a tree that's in the legume family, also known as the pea or the bean family. And what you're going to have here, there's 2 parts that you can eat off of this tree. That's the flowers, which precede the leaves, okay? And you can eat the fruits, which are going to be the tender young pods, as you can see here in this black and white illustration on the right-hand side. These taste delicious. They taste like little sweet peas without the mushiness of a pea. So very nice springtime treat. And what's also really nice is a tree will be absolutely covered in them. So you'll be driving down, 270 to DC, and you'll see them just like going by, up 95 in Virginia. There's a lot of them as well. So there's a lot of them in the DMV. And anyway, as we talked about the flower buds, you can pickle them, you can saute them, have them at trailside nibble, add them to your salad, saute them up. The young pods, you want to get the tender pods only. You don't want to eat the mature ones. There's, the pea family is kind of an odd one. It's not, that's like, it's poisonous, but, they do have the plant compounds in it that we've talked about that, plants do have. And you want the younger ones. You're going to find this, like the red bud, along roadsides, moist woods, thickets. It does like good soil, but you'll see it along the highways around. You'll find it. I know there's a really nice, lots of it growing up in Columbia. If you're ever up there, there's a nice little walking path near the Whole Foods. You can go up there and check it out. I think some of these pictures are from there. Now, the inner bark, you can make a tea out of it. It's highly astringent. That means it's tightening to the tissues. So if you have any issues with diarrhea or things of that nature, and you need to stop it, and you're out in the wild, and you can't get any medicines from a store, this is something that you can use. It's good to know what plants are astringent for that purposes, because that is a big issue if you're out in the wild in a survival situation. If you do get GI problems that you're going to lose fluids, you need to stop that as soon as possible. Now, identification notes, the leaves are heart-shaped with pointed tips. We kind of saw that. And smooth edges. That means they're smooth along the margins. 3 to 6 inches wide. And the flowers are absolutely just showy in clusters. So you see some of the beautiful leaves there. And it's a very beautiful plant. So definitely check this one out. Next up is another invasive. This is known as Japanese knotweed. And by its own name, you can figure out it didn't come from America. Anyway, this is a really highly nutritious plant, but it is extremely invasive. So since it's nutritious and it's pretty delicious, then you probably should eat all of it that you can possibly find. Anyway, it's going to flower from May through September. The thing about this one, it grows crazy. I mean, like it literally starts from like a little like shoot, coming up to being taller than me, and probably, I'm sure, taller than you, considering it can get up to 10 feet in a season. I mean, so by summer, it's going to be taking over, the areas which it's in. Now, the leaves, when they're young and fresh like that, when they're all the shiny young green and they're just unfurling, delicious. They do have a nice kind of a sour taste to it. Another way with identifying this is they call it Mexican bamboo, American bamboo. It's not bamboo at all, but it does grow fast like you would expect with bamboo. And it is, except for it's in the knotweed family, and of course the name is knotweed. And what that means is that the joints, it's going to have knots, but in between the joints, it's hollow. So you'll definitely notice that. I think if you look at this picture here on the left-hand side, you can see where the old stock, my hand is around where it is hollow. And then as you can see the joints, you're very commonly going to see the zigzag pattern here in the center with the leaves growing in that fashion. And we have the leaves that are entire at the margins, which means that they are not toothed, they are smooth. And these flowers here, great for the bees, makes a really nice honey. But we still don't want this here. Now, a really great way to get this plant is these shoots here. See how red they are, especially? Now, when I made these muffins, which I have the recipe, I can share it with you. They're really good. You want to get the shoots when they're really young and tender. If not, unfortunately, you have to do what I did, which was peel them, which I'm not a big fan of doing. I like efficiency. And if I would have just gotten them a little sooner, I wouldn't have had to do that because the shoots would be tender enough to do so. Now, you may have heard that plants with red in them are poisonous and toxic, and that is true in some cases, but there are plants out there that don't have red that are extremely poisonous, and there's plants out there that have red that are extremely safe. So you learn the plants, don't learn arbitrary rules, because you will find exceptions, and exceptions can be deadly. Okay, so with respect to this, what is also extremely great about this plant here is that you can use basically all parts of it. Okay, we're going to talk a little more about that in a second, but I want to go a side note on the medicinal benefits. You may have heard of resveratrol. Resveratrol is the compound that is in the red wine that is alleged to give it all the anti-aging and health benefits. Now, obviously, drinking alcohol, there's downsides to that, but that's for people to decide, what they would like to do. But if you want to get a very cheap, and I'm talking free, source of resveratrol, which is where, if you're thinking about where they are getting it, if you can buy this at a store as a supplement, they're getting it from this. They're actually growing this because it grows without any effort, and getting the resveratrol from those shoots, and then, putting it into capsules and then selling it at a very, high premium. Of course, you can collect this early on and do the same thing and get the resveratrol. It is an excellent source of vitamin C, and resveratrol has been shown to be a very potent anti-parasitic agent, and it has definitely been shown to be anti-cancer, helps with diabetes, and possibly anti-aging. I'll put quotes on that. In traditional Chinese medicine and traditional Japanese medicine, it's used to treat fungal and bacterial infections, various skin inflammations, and cardiovascular diseases. It is being looked at as a potential treatment for Lyme disease, which does make sense because that's caused from a bacteria. So it would make sense that this might have some potential there. This is a perennial. It's going to keep coming up over and over again, and it's going to spread by seed as well. This one is just a mess of a plant when it gets in there. So please try to do your best to get rid of this one, because it does take over and it destroys the local environment as far as the native, species. And edibility: the tender young shoots up to 1 foot, raw juice blended, sauteed, steamed like asparagus, the tender young leaves as a salad green or as a trail side nibble, as I talked about. The stems, you can simmer them in soup, use them in making sauces and jams. The seeds, you can grind them into flour, add to soups and stews for extra nutrition and flavor, as well as a thickening agent, okay? And the rhizomes, we talked about the rhizomes with respect to cattails, so you should be familiar with those are. You can eat that, in this case, as a root vegetable, whereas with the cattails, you have to pound those starches out. This is something that you can actually just eat. So make sure you're getting them from a safe location, of course. This does have the tendency to take over areas that had been cut down through, like along, railroad tracks, or power lines was a big one. I know when I was a child, they had cleared out for power lines where I lived, to get to my neighbors. I lived in a very rural area, like very rural Appalachian type of area. And anyway, so they had that, and they would grow up every year, and I'd be so happy when the electric company would come in and just like cut it down, so I could, because it interfered with my pathways to the woods. And like I said, it was very isolated where I lived. Like you couldn't see a neighbor's house even at night. You couldn't see a light. It was completely pitch black where I lived, and it was interesting to say the least. But I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Anyway, the chickweeds are another common plant grouping that is edible. We will have what we think about the Stellaria species. So that's going to be that genus. And then there's the genus that would house the mouse-eared chickweed. And as you can expect, that name is going to suggest that it has a lot of hair on it, which it does. Now, they're both going to be edible, and there is native and non-native in both of these genus. So you're going to definitely see that. We're going to have the star chickweed, which is a native to, that's a, very palatable one, less so than the common chickweed. We'll talk about that. And so what we're dealing with here is just basically you can consume them in the same way. I wouldn't recommend eating the mouse-eared chickweed raw because of the hair. It's not very palatable, but in all other fashions, they can be consumed. And, in an emergency situation, you got to do what you got to do. Some people are less sensitive to hair on the plants and stuff like that. So this just shows the star chickweed. You might find this one growing in the woods. That's where it likes to grow. It's one of our native ones. It's very beautiful. The flowers are going to be very, very big. And what you're going to see with these plants, it's going to appear that it has 10 petals, but it doesn't. It has 5. They're just so deeply cut that it gives the appearance. So that's a very common thing. So if you look up close, you'll see that these are actually connected at the bases, but you'd have to pull them apart, to see that. And even in this illustration, it looks like they're absolutely together, but there's only 5. And very beautiful plant. Whenever you see them, the star chickweed, you're going to see a cluster. They're a pretty big plant in comparison to the common chickweed. Now, the common chickweed being smaller, you still will find a lot of it. It's colonial. That means it's colony forming, so there's going to be a lot. As far as palatability, this is good. Definitely better than mouse-ear chickweed, but it's not as good as the common chickweed, which is extremely delicious and very good. Now, you're going to find hair on these as well. It's just not going to be, there's going to be hair on the stems and stuff and things like that, especially usually like a fine one going up the stem. There'll be like one line, not uncommon to see. Or, you'll see it on all the way around, depending on what species it is. There are a lot of different species of this that you might encounter, so you're just going to be looking at the common characteristics to know that you're dealing with a chickweed. And that's basically, what you can be looking for. So it's very interesting plant. Obviously, this has a lot of hair on it. This would be, I would say, in the mouse-ear chickweed genus as well. And this one would not be. So over here on the right is definitely common chickweed. And it's very delicious and very nutritious. And again, you can look into the differences between a field chickweed and a mouse-ear chickweed. That's just getting into the details that if you're interested, from the botanical point of view, you can check into. And you can also use this grid, which will help by looking at the comparison between the petals versus the sepals. The sepals are going to be the green parts that are outside of it. Okay, what I'm pointing to here. And if the petals are longer than that, or if they're shorter, that's going to help you with your identification. And so according to the research, there's at least 100 species and subspecies out there. It's worldwide they're found. So you're going to find them no matter what continent you are, of course, except for Antarctica, if that's a continent, I'm not sure. And haven't been there, so I can't attest. And anyway, so as stated, the Stellaria species is the one going to be less hairy, so that can be eaten raw. When the other species, which I can't pronounce properly, so I'm not even going to try, what is called the mouse-eared chickweeds, is best to cook or blend or put into your smoothies, so you won't have to have that hair in direct contact with your tongue, which could make you not very happy. Anyway, it talks about where you can find it. You're going to find it in lots of different places. Again, the star chickweed is going to be in the woods, like under the canopy. It will grow there in the spring. You'll find it growing along the trillium and the jack and the pulpits and the Solomon sill and the false Solomon sill and the toothworts and all that. Those plants are native, and we're not talking about those. For that purpose, I would recommend, if you're going to eat any, eat the common chickweed. It is a non-native species. I would try to preserve the native plants as much as we possibly can. They are, we're taking away a lot of the environment of where they're, where they normally grow. So, and when we disturb the land, that's when the invasive ones definitely can get a foothold in. So you can check into the medicinal things. You can make a tea out of this, relieve coughs, cooling. It's a demulcent, expectorant. And demulcent just means it's going to be soothing to your GI tract and to your stomach and things of that nature. Expectorant means it's going to help, the coughs be productive. You can use it as a wash or poultice for skin diseases, rash, insect bites, etc., to alleviate itching and reduce inflammation. Now, there is a word of warning, and that is the lookalike, the scarlet pimpernel. Now, obviously, the flowers look nothing alike, but it's the issue could arise for someone not being familiar and they see the leaves, they look very similar, but I'm going to give you some quick pointers on how to tell them apart. Even though one of the common names is red chickweed, this is not a chickweed, so don't think that it has uses in that way. This is actually a toxic plant for consumption. It's very pretty, but it is not something we eat. Now, this has a lot of different names. You can check them out down there. It's why it's always good to be familiar with the botanical names, especially if you can't pronounce it, at least in print, you're familiar with it. This is a non-native, but you will find it growing a lot around where chickweed is. And what's interesting about this is the color here. We see like the orange kind of salmon color, but it can be blue. It can be, I think, white. I've never seen any of those. I only have seen this one. But how we can tell the difference is this is one of the plants that has a square stem. Chickweeds have a round stem. Square versus round. So if it's not flowering, so if you encounter something that you think might be a chickweed and has a square stem, it is not a chickweed. Bottom line. And these have opposite leaves. Okay. So just like a chickweed would. Now, I know that when we're dealing with our mints, we have square stems and opposite leaves. But if you know, mints will be opposite, but then they'll be perpendicular to each other. Perpendicular in that opposite fashion. Okay? Now, that being said, the flowers are completely different. And, you know, the mint family is going to be aromatic as well. So, this is about the environment you're going to see it growing in. Here it's growing alongside some docks, which were covered, I think, in the part 2 presentation. There's some violet leaves over here. These are some broadleaf dock leaves. And there is some yellowwood sorrel right here. And this is, you know, so you're going to see it growing. So this is one, and if you were out there getting your yellowwood sorrel or your violet leaves, you might go, I don't know about this. And here, where it's not flowering, is where the confusion could come in to play with the chickweed. Okay? So keep those things in mind. Do not consume this. Definitely learn the shape of this one. I mean, the way that the leaves are, you know, they do rotate up around. Plants do that because it gives them better sunlight options. And just be aware that it's out there. And again, this is the one where this, if you break it open, the sap from the stems and the foliage can cause dermatitis in some people. A lot of plants can do that. So just, you know, some people are more sensitive to others, you know, than others rather. Seeds are slightly poisonous to some mammals. Are we one of those mammals? I have no idea. Anyway, this doesn't taste good. It's going to be bitter and acrid. Chickweed is going to be pleasant tasting. It's very mild. And so please don't confuse it with chickweed. Men, remember, round stems. Or for speedwell, which is used mostly for medicinal, but it is, you know, it could be deemed edible as well. It's just not as palatable. And speedwell is going to have blue flowers and round, hairy stems. So remember, square versus round. And you'll find this flowering in the summertime. A spring edible, which is delicious, and it's a spring ephemeral, which means it comes and it goes. So this will not persist. There are some plants that flower in the spring, but then their leaves and stuff will persist until, you know, into the summer, into the fall. This is not one of those. So we have 2 species around here. We have the Virginia Spring Beauty and we have the Carolina Spring Beauty. Now, both of them can be used interchangeably. The leaves of the Virginia Spring Beauty are thinner, more dainty, if you will. And but they are both edible. And why they call this fairy spud is because of this corm right here. So if you look at the illustration here, down at the bottom, there's a corm. It's not very big, so you have to get quite a few of these, you know. But you can actually boil them and take them out of their tough little jacket, and then you got these little fairy spuds. And you can also eat the little flowers. They're delicious. And well, delicious is an exaggeration. They're like, you know, dandelion level, you know, and they're not chicory level because I don't like chicory flowers. But, so they're, you know, they're good. They're trailside nibble, you know. I'd still rather have a chocolate bar, but it is what it is. This is the miner's lettuce family. So if you're out west, that's a very common wild edible, but out here we don't have it, unfortunately. So here's the Carolina Spring Beauty, quite a beautiful plant. as well. You see that the leaves are just going to be wider, but again, you can use them interchangeably, and both of them are around in our area. They are going to flower from March until May. Here is this is about a quarter mile from where I live, and this field is very damp, and spring beauties like damp areas. They don't like to grow in the swamp. You can see the cattails back here. There's also skunk cabbage growing along this area, and a lot of other interesting plants. But right now, the last time I was over here was just completely, there's nothing. They're not up yet because they're not coming up. It is a little too cold. But when you do find them, they are very colonial. You're going to find a lot of them. So if you were to harvest, 10 or 20 of these out of here, that would be totally fine because there's enough to, for the seeds to go and, fill in the gaps, okay? So this isn't a situation, in that case that you would over harvest them. So keep those things in mind whenever you're foraging. Do not take more than you need, and just keep it, we need things for next year, we need things for the animals, and we need things for, natural beauty. So again, we talked about the corms, which are the little tuber type things, and the entire above ground portion of the plant are safe for human consumption. And the roots, the little tuber corms, they can be eaten raw or cooked like a potato. Boil them, serve them with butter and oil, salt and pepper, however you want to do it. And we talked about the Virginia Spring Beauty versus the Carolina. You're going to find them around. Next, we're going to talk about some more crucifers. This is the hairy bittercress. You also find the Pennsylvania bittercress and a bunch of other bittercresses. You might find rock cresses and cow cresses. They're all edible, and so it is not a big deal to be all concerned about exactly which one, unless that is what you're into, which I kind of am. But anyway, as far as edibility, this is a very good one. It is growing right now, so it's one of the early ones. It's definitely going to be here in the late winter. Some areas, even in Virginia, you'll find it in January, late December. It's pretty much, going to be persisting through the winter. Up here in Maryland, where I'm in the mountains, not so much. But it is definitely one of the things to grow very early on. So again, crucifers, 4 petals, 6 stamens, seed pods that look like all the other mustard family plants that we have encountered thus far. Variability amongst the leaves compared to the other cresses. We'll see the Pennsylvania bittercress is a little bit different. Again, just like the other crucifers, we're talking the whole plant can be edible. We're talking the flowers, the leaves, the roots. Substitute for horseradish. It's going to be, peppery tasting. It's very common, things with the crucifers. There's also, we'll talk about it in a second. But the one thing I do want to note here is look at my finger in comparison to this plant. This plant is absolutely tiny, yet flowering at the same time. Very small. You will often find a lot of these, but each of them are very tiny and very little. So you can see down here, my thumb with this little one. This is, not going to get you too far as food goes, but these are very tiny little flowers, and you see how low growing these are. But there's definitely to know. I mean, if you look at this, the flowers here, there's my finger, and that's how tiny these are in the seed pods. But this is what you can get in the early spring, and we got to take what we can get. The young leaves are edible raw, and other tender parts of the plants can be cooked. The older leaves can be steamed. They have a peppery flavor. Seed pods, raw, stir-fried, pickled before seeds mature and harden. Though, of course, you can use the seeds if you would like to collect them. They're a little more tedious than some of the bigger crucifers, but that is whatever you are into. The roots, you can mix them with vinegar, make a good horseradish substitute. And we saw the plant. It's in a rosette shape. It's pinnately divided into 8 to 15 leaflets, short stems connecting to the petiole. That's all the botanical stuff. We don't need to concern ourselves. You can check into that if you want. And now, they call it hairy bittercress, but if you do notice, the it's sparsely hairy. You know what I mean? We're talking hair. We're not talking fuzzy, unpalatable. It just has some hairs. Whereas you're not going to see that as much in the Pennsylvania bittercress, which is a bigger plant, and it's a little bit later, April through October. But you might find this, again, you can consume it in the similar ways, and you can definitely check into how it doesn't have the basal rosette, and the identification is a little bit different, but can be consumed in the same way. Another crucifer that we have around here, and this is actually a big, delicious one, and it does grow pretty large, is watercress. So it has some, large leaves, the bigger flowers. They're much more noticeable. You don't need to, get down with a magnifier to get a picture of those. And you will grow a lot of it. And keep in mind, as the cautions and warnings on getting things out of water, make sure that you clean this one in a way that will be safe. You don't want any pathogens, from fresh water that you could get, like Giardia or Cryptosporidium or any other, ickies. And quite a beautiful plant. You have it growing along here. I believe this is Monacacy, but this could be in Hagerstown. I'm not exactly. I would guess Monacacy outside Frederick. Keep in mind it's a national park. Don't forage there. But you can go there and definitely check it out, get some pictures, get familiar with it. And these are just some additional pictures of the watercress. Absolutely beautiful plant. You can find that you find that not necessarily growing, actually kind of in a way, because usually it's a living plant that they're selling at the grocery stores, and you can get it. It's very nice. Have it on salads. Just keep in mind the water source. Anyway, it's one of the oldest known vegetables that have been consumed. Again, the caution is the risk of the protozoan parasites. You can't see those. Those are microscopic, single-celled organisms, and they will, even though they're single-celled organisms, they will multiply, and they can cause very serious health issues in humans. Now, again, soak those leaves in that food-grade hydrogen peroxide or salt water, for an extended period of time, an hour or so. I would go at least, and then you can consume them. Now, what's nice about this, and you might wonder, how does this float? Well, watercress has hollow stems, and they float in the water, and it's very interesting. So when they do form dense mats, which is why there's going to be a lot of it. And the flowers can be kind of whitish greenish, very beautiful. And again, four-petaled, just like like we always will see with the crucifers, right? I haven't seen one that doesn't have that. Maybe there is, but not to my knowledge. Fresh leaves are high in vitamin A and vitamin C, and also iodine if harvested before flowering. Diuretic and serve as a blood purifier. And we saw where it grows. Another one you might find growing around there is the creeping yellow cress. Now, this isn't going to grow in the water, but it's going to grow on in fields and things like that. This is an invasive, and it is non-native. It is not as palatable as some of the other cresses because it doesn't have like the biggest leaves. Again, with the crucifers, all are edible, just some aren't so palatable. So those are the things you need to keep in mind, is none of them are going to, be poisonous, just some don't taste as good. But in a survival situation, we might not be that picky. Now, this one here is actually a really delicious one. It is the field mustard. And when we're dealing with these, now we have a lot of the four-petaled yellow flowers. We've seen a lot of the crucifers with the white flowers. Now we're seeing some with yellow. So again, the color doesn't matter. We also saw the Dame's Rocket with the lavender, purple flowers as well. And there's a lot of scientific evidence for this genus, especially having cancer preventing, not causing. It's the opposite. This is the cancer preventing. But again, these are goitrogens, so keep that in mind with your thyroid. So this, the field mustard is my favorite as far as the mustards go, and, comparing it to like the black mustard or, any of the yellow cresses or yellow rocket. Anyway, keep in mind that, these are they do have a lot of flavor and a lot of compounds in it. That can be an irritant and emetic in high doses, and we have the goitrogenic properties. The leaves, you can make a tea out of it. And by tea, obviously, tea is a technical plant name, but, we're talking herbal teas in that terminology. So I'm using that term very loosely, okay? But anyway, you would make a hot beverage. They call it a tisane for rheumatism, toothaches, headaches. The seeds eaten as a tonic, appetite stimulant. The seeds have been used for various health conditions as well. I've never done that myself, so I'm not going to speak too much on it. And but the mustard flavor, that can be a strong irritant, so just keep in mind that eating large quantities of it might actually cause some irritation. That goes for most any plant. I mean, think about a pineapple. You eat enough of that, that's actually going to cause some sensitivities in the mouth and GI tract as well. So it's about moderation and keeping things in balance. Now, another mustard you might find that's not native is the black mustard. You might find that growing around Brassica nigra. The leaves aren't too unpalatable. Great source of getting the seeds. And you can use the seeds to season pickles, used to make hot mustard. Ground it. Should say grind. This is a bad use of the English language, I suppose. But grind it up and use it with vinegar. Anyway, the lower leaves are going to be irregular shaped. We're going to see the field mustard, and we'll see how you can tell the difference between them. But again, we can sprout these seeds for nutrient boost, detoxification, just like you would with broccoli seeds. And again, with it being in non-native, you're going to find it in that disturbed areas in the fields. The one I like is the field mustard. You can definitely tell this by the way that the leaves clasp that stem. Okay, they're semi-perfoliate there. And the seed pods are going to be really pronounced in this one, as you can see here. And it's a kind of a lighter green than some of the black mustard or the yellow rocket, which we're going to see in a second. I find this to be the most palatable for my taste, but your taste could be quite different. It's going to have paler yellow flowers than some of the other species that we'll see. But again, it's up to you. The nice thing about this one too, since it gets to be like 2.5 feet, it's a pretty big plant. So, you wouldn't need too many of these to be able to get a nice, addition to your meal, for yourself or for a couple people. So the young leaves, salad addition, cooked green, steamed, sauteed. Leaves become more bitter with age, but hey, even humans sometimes become more bitter with age. Anyway, unopened flower buds without leaves, they can be very bitter. Steam for 3 to 5 minutes. The green seed pods you can pickle or raw in salads, because these ones are big seed pods. Now the seeds you can season pickles, used to make that hot vinegar, just like we saw with the other one. And we see the kind of the grayer green leaves in this, and I'm gonna note that for a reason, because we're gonna see another plant that is a crucifer that's gonna have kind of a bluish green. And it is not poisonous, but it is not palatable, and they use it for other purposes rather than eating. So we're going to talk about that in a second. So, the dyer's woad, and this is the one I'm talking about. And they actually use this since medieval times for a blue dye. Now they do use it for other things. It has been brought over here, so you might find it growing, especially in Virginia. There is a lot of it in Shenandoah National Park. It's kind of taken over the meadow there, big meadow. Is it Big Meadows or Big Meadow? But anyway, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's one of the big key areas of Shenandoah, and outside the park as well. You'll find a lot of this growing alongside fields and roadsides, which are where these pictures are from. So you can kind of see it has more of a blue undertone rather than the grayish that would differentiate it from the field mustard, and the leaves are different. Now that obviously they don't use it as often because they started using indigo, and then that became rather expensive, so they found synthetic dyes. But quite a beautiful one. Another common one you will see is the yellow rocket. Rocket is a name for another plant in crucifers. We call that arugula, so some people would call that this too. But it is you might hear it called yellow rocket, rocket cress, winter rocket, things of that nature. People have a lot of different names for it. Anyway, of course, it's going to be edible, just like you would find with the other ones. In the South, it's this very common green eaten, and they call it creasy greens. Not greasy, creasy. C-R-E-A-S-Y, I would assume how one would spell that. Maybe because they kind of has creases in the leaves there. I'm not exactly sure why that name came about. If you know, please let me know. You're going to eat it just like you would any of the other ones. You can eat the buds, the flowers, but the buds and the flowers in this one is going to be a little more bitter, but you can cut that bitterness by boiling it in 2 changes of water. Now, when you're doing things that you're reducing the bitterness in your greens or whatever you're cooking, typically it would be, greens and then the changing over, or maybe it's, shoots of a plant. You want to have hot water at the ready, because when you dump out the boiling water, you want to apply hot boiling water back to it. Because if you add cold water back and wait for it to go through the cycle of heating up again, one, that's going to take a long time. But 2, you're going to, that going from hot to cold is going to fix that bitterness in it. So you can keep changing the water over and over again, and it's not going to help you one iota. Now, the other thing too is doing a couple rapid changes usually helps. Don't necessarily boil and forever, depending on how many times you're going to do it. But definitely, a few times. It isn't like where you have to do it multiple times, like, with pokeweed shoots or maybe with common milkweed, where you want to get those toxins out of it that can be potentially poisonous. And this is just a palatability issue. Okay? So you can definitely read about the medicinal benefits of this. We've kind of talked about some of them. You can make the poultice out of the leaves on this one, and probably for some of the other ones as well. This just has, some of the ones that have the smaller leaves not so good, and the leaves do get peppery. Next up, we're going to talk about nettles. Nettles are going to flower from June to September, but we want to be getting the leaves and eating these plants before they go to the flowering stage. Now, there's a few different types of stinging nettles around that. They're in the Urtica genus, okay? And then we also have the wood nettle, which is not technically in that genus, though in some classifications they put it in. So keep these things in mind. These are botanists that have kind of argued amongst themselves throughout the centuries about where plants should be. So there's been shifts and movements around. So as you see, the synonym down there is in the Urtica genus as well. Take all that for what it will. It's good to kind of know how to be familiar with these. Now, stinging nettles like these, you're going to find them along roadsides, disturbed areas, moist ground, and usually when you find them, you're going to find a patch of them. So it's kind of nice. One of the best things you can do is, especially now they're not flowering. This was taken, I would say, about June. I think this picture was taken. I think this was up near the Juniata River up in Pennsylvania near Bedford a few summers ago. And anyway, the top portions off, if you have kitchen shears, you can go out there and collect them in a little basket or whatever works for you. Don't really use your hands because these things will hurt you, and that can get irritating, and those stings can persist for many hours, and especially when the plants are young, and if you're out there digging around and not paying attention. Again, it's not going to hurt you long term, it just can be an irritant. And the other one we're going to talk about is the wood nettles. And they are different as far as their look. Now, we did see with the stinging nettles, the leaves are going to be opposite. With the wood nettles, they are going to be more alternate and kind of a little erratic in their growth structure. Where the stinging nettles, as you can see, they're a little orderly, whereas the wood nettles, they're kind of all over the place. Maybe they have to be because they're growing under the canopy. You're going to find these in the woods. Especially around the native areas. Very nice plant to encounter, completely edible as well. And when you find it, you find a lot of it. And this just shows kind of the contrast between them again. There's some people that state that the wood nettle is actually more nutritious than the stinging nettles, but they both are, so it doesn't really matter. Stinging nettles, I've recently learned that they can be used for making fire, and that they're a good fire starter, and that there's also uses for cordage. So it'd be interesting to check that out with the wood nettle as well as doing some experimentation with the stinging nettles for the bushcraft purposes of kindling and fire starting. And as you can see here, with the stinging nettle, you have more of a kind of a angular stem, whereas you're going to have more of a rounder stem with the wood nettle. And with the stinging nettle, the stem is a little more stout, whereas with the wood nettle, it's a little more kind of bent and kind of goes with the flow a little bit. So I'm figuring that the stinging nettles would be probably better for cordage than the wood nettles, but that's something I'm going to try to mess around with this summer and determine that. Some of the other species of nettles around is the slender and the dwarf. Dwarf nettles that you might find around. Again, you can absolutely use them. And I guess they call the little dwarf nettle the burning nettle, so maybe that means it's really good as a fire starter. I do not know. I definitely want to check a little bit more into that. Feel free to enlighten me if you're more familiar with it. And this just talks about the edible uses of it. Of course, the leaves and the stems prior to flowering is the best time, and prior to the seed production. The young shoots and the tender top leaves are the best. You can steam, saute, juice, blend in smoothies, add to eggs, casseroles, stews, as butter, use as a broth. Now you can dry these and use them for later use as either a tea or for making broth, or as adding to your soup base, adding it to your chilies or whatever in the wintertime, get some extra nutrients into our system. Extremely nutritional plant, very good, and has a lot of proven benefits. Now you can dry, cook, and soak these nettles in water to remove the chemicals that cause the sting. That is very important. This is not something that you're going to go out and add it to your salad and whatnot like that. But you can eat some raw out in the wild. You just need to be careful. Don't go out and do it unless you're willing to get stung on your hands. We talked about the bushcraft, the cordage, the string from the fibrous stalks, the dried stalks for tinder and kindling. It's very possible with it. Maybe the stalks don't have to be dry. I definitely not that well versed in that, so I definitely want to check that out. And medicinally, fresh to dried leaves, stems, young shoots, flowers. You can have tea or by consumption. It's going to address nutritional deficiencies, treat kidney, urinary, gastrointestinal disorders, improve immune function, and purify the blood. Urtication, if I'm saying that correctly, I don't think I am. Urtication. It's flogging with nettles to produce an inflammatory reaction. And it's a folk remedy for rheumatism. That's mean joint pains and kind of arthritic pains type of deal. It's antibacterial, has potential use as an anti-cancer, kind of treatment. There's been a lot of medicinal herbs that have been used throughout the century, not making any claims thereof, but they have allegedly been used as folk cancer remedies, so not sure how effective they were, but it's just something to consider. And the root, making a tincture, it's been used to treat benign prostate hyperplasia and urinary issues, so something to keep in mind, a good medicinal. Growing alongside this, you might find another plant that's in the nettle family. This does have, it was actually a synonym of this plant is actually an urtica. It's actually in that genus, but again, there's a lot of debate on it. You might find it growing alongside the wood nettles. It's going to grow into the the canopy, the understory of the woods. And there's no stings on it, but it does have the characteristics with the way the flowers are and the leaves. I've never tried this. It's been stated that people have eaten it and confusing it for nettles. Obviously, it's not poisonous. And they call it clearweed because, sometimes when you're looking through the stems and the stalks, it's almost like semi-translucent. It's quite a pretty plant. And so technically edible, I'm assuming you can eat it the same way. I haven't tried yet. I always say I will, but, one day I guess. And you're going to find it again alongside the wood nettles. You can use the leaves or poultice or a wash to alleviate itch and soothe cuts and wounds. Obviously, you cannot do that with the wood nettle or the stinging nettle because that's actually why you would probably need this poultice. So maybe if you do get stung with the stinging nettles, maybe you can use this to alleviate those stings. I don't know. I'm just making a hypothetical, theoretical possibility there. I haven't tried it, so I cannot state. Anyway, the leaves juice, they have used the juice to treat sinus and problems by inhaling the liquid. Think about it in a neti pot type of situation, which is a saline, but maybe that's how they use that for this purpose. And it was also listed in the Petersons that it was used to treat excessive hunger historically, but I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that. Does it taste so bad that you never want to eat again, or is it just so filling that you're like, wow, this is amazing? I don't know. Something to determine. Next up, we're going to talk about the Galliums genus here. We'll talk about some of the species that are in there. We have the cleavers and we have numerous types of bed straws. Now, cleavers are something that can be eaten, but they cannot be eaten raw because they have these hooks and barbs on it that would irritate your GI, your mouth, and everything like that. So you do not want to eat them raw, but you can absolutely make teas out of it. You can cook them, juice them and stuff like that. You just don't want to get cut with these. Now, the purpose of these is so the plant, which is a very limp plant, it uses it to climb onto other plants and hold on. So it uses what it's got for its purposes of making sure it gets enough sunlight. Now, the bed straws are a little kind of stouter, so they can actually not have to grow on things, and they don't have any of the barbs, and they are smooth. So you might find the Gallium molugo, false baby's breath, as they call it, hedge bed straw. You might find the northern bed straw as well. You're going to get these nice white flowers that are four petaled and across. They're not crucifers because again, We still don't have all of those other characteristics of the crucifers. What we have is a square stem, and we have whorled leaves. Okay, we're not going to see that in a crucifer. And we're also, we don't have the stamens that are the 6 stamens as well that we would see in the crucifers. Another ID there. Okay, so what we do have is whorled. So that's the leaf structure. We're not talking opposite or alternate. We're talking leaves that go around the stem, okay? And we have a square stem, just like mint family plants, but mint family plants don't have whorled leaves, so we can keep things straight. This is in the coffee family, known as the madder family or the bedstraw family. It's important to think about the coffee part, because the leaves of this, not the leaves, the seeds rather, pods, you can actually dry, roast, and grind as a coffee substitute that actually does have some caffeine in it. So we're going to definitely talk about that a little bit in a second, but you might find this other type here that's in the this genus, and it's a sweet-scented bedstraw growing through here. They call that street woodruff. And we have the fragrant bedstraw as well. So that's another one that you might see growing, especially in the wooded areas. It definitely likes moist, kind of woody areas. And it is one of our native species as well. And here we have the cleavers. We're going to have those 4-petaled flowers that are white. But if you note, look how tiny they are on cleavers. They're so small. And when I'm talking about the seeds that you can dry and roast, this is what I'm talking about. These are some tiny seeds. But it's all we got. It's all we got. Now, we are going to see on this one here a lot more of the seeds, so you might be able to collect a little bit more of those. And these flowers are bigger than what you're going to find on the cleavers here. So you can collect all of these on the bedstraw and the cleavers. And anyway, we talked about how we can eat them as a cooked green and sauteed juice blend in smoothies. The bedstraw can be eaten raw as a salad green, but not the cleavers. And I'm assuming they called it bedstraw probably because it was soft, and they probably collected it and put it in their beds, in the 1800s before we had, Tempur-Pedic mattresses and all that. And the whole plant does have uses, especially the above ground. The cleavers, it has been used to enhance lymphatic system function. That is something that, we want to keep that lymphatic system healthy and moving. So we want to flush out toxins and decrease congestion and reduce swelling. Another good way to do that is do some jumping jacks every day. Keep your system moving, or dry brushing, but I'm digressing. And the fruits can be dried, roasted, ground as the lower caffeine coffee substitute. So it's a fun one. Maybe add that to some dandelion, for a coffee extender if times get lean, or if things go haywire. You never know. Another plant is the plantain. We have 2 common species. Both of them are introduced. It's the broadleaf plantain and the narrowleaf plantain. We have Plantago major and Plantago lanceolate. Now, the broadleaf, as you can see by its name, they also called that white man's foot because the Native Americans would see it start sprouting up, and then they would allegedly refer to it as such because it wasn't invasive and it had followed the people that had come into the land. And on the right hand side we have the narrow leaf, also known as the English or the ribwort. So they call that ribwort because, if you can see, they have these very pronounced veins that go through here, and you can actually pull these out and use these. They have used these, they're very strong, as something to make sutures in the wild, so that has a use there. And if you might be familiar with psyllium, it's actually, these are closely related to that. Psyllium is from India region, that area. It's not from here, but it's Plantago psyllium is actually the genus, or the genus is Plantago, and the name is psyllium for the species. And anyway, they do have similarities because we can use these seed pods and the high fiber as a kind of a substitute for psyllium as well. And as you can see, these little seeds are very small, and we do have these super, super tiny little flowers here on these seed pods. Now, the English is going to be a lot taller than we're going to find with the broadleaf, but we're going to have with the broadleaf low growing, and then these stalks, which can be pretty high, 6 to 18 inches tall. Typically, 18 is going to be a stretch, but it could happen. And this one's actually going to get to be much taller, and they have a shorter flower head, and they can be used interchangeably as far as edibility. Again, all above ground parts are going to be edible. The young leaves, raw as a salad green, juice blended, steamed, sauteed, added to soups. Older leaves, they can be juiced or blended. They get very fibrous, so you keep those things in mind. The seeds and the flowers, they can be dried and ground into a high fiber flower extender, not a substitute. There's no gluten or anything to bind it. And again, medicinally, the leaves, this is one of the best plants. Use a spit poultice or salve. Treat wounds, insect bites, poison ivy, stings, boils, sores, and allegedly snake bites. It's a drying agent, so that's where it might be good for that. But don't use this as your go-to if you out there and you get bit by a snake. Please seek medical attention as quickly as possible and do the things that you need to follow with respect to that. Avoiding snakes is usually the best option. Treat every snake that you encounter as if it is venomous. Do not go up and ask its name first. Just assume and move along. It is antibacterial, this leaf, anti-parasitic, antimicrobial, antihistamine, demulcent. Demulcent just means soothing to the tissue. Expectorant, so it's going to help with those things. Diuretic, it's going to help with the pulling water out and with kidney function. Keep these things in mind if you are on diuretic medication. This is one plant you need to know about. So we need to think about them, especially these plants are highly medicinal as well because they haven't been cultivated, so the medicine is still there. So whenever we're talking about plantain and if it's diuretic, if you're on a medication that is a diuretic, you might have to think on that, talk to your doctor about it. If you're talking about garlic, which is blood thinning, if you're on anticoagulants, keep those things in mind. Or if you have to make sure that you don't have anticoagulants, make sure that you consult with a doctor on those things. That being said, I shall proceed with the plantain. It is highly astringent and it helps stop bleeding. And stopping bleeding, we would refer to that as styptic. One of the best medicinal plants out there for that is yarrow. But if you can't find any yarrow, you can use plantain. Also, for packing wounds like the spit poultice, what I mean is you take some of that plant, you put it in your mouth, you chew it up, and you make a spit poultice and literally put it on you. I know it sounds awful, right? But it's your spit, so you should be cool with that. Anyway, you can treat wounds, and like I said, very good for those type of things. The seeds and the flowers is going to be mucilaginous, lubricating, bulk-forming laxative, similar to what we would find in the psyllium husk that we spoke about. Soothes sore throats in the digestive tract. That's because it is demulcent. Next up is burdock. And so what we have is we have a couple of different varieties around here. We have the greater and the lesser. Both of them are non-native, but both of them can be used interchangeably. And as you can see on the left-hand side here, we have the first year, so we have it going to be low growing. In the second year, it's going to bolt. It is a biennial. When we're dealing with biennials and we want to harvest the root, when we want to do that, and that's if we're talking about chicory, if we're talking about wild carrot, if we're talking about burdock or, other plants like yellow dock, broadleaf dock. Anytime you want to get the root, you want to get it after that first hard frost, wait about a week, because what is happening in the summertime in the first year, it is the leaves are out there and they're capturing all that energy from the sun, the chlorophyll going in there, storing it all up. And then once the coldness comes in, they're like, okay, it's time for us to go dormant for the winter. And all that energy that has been stored up in the summertime in these leaves is going to retract, go down into those roots, and it is going to store into the roots for the winter time. So that's when all the sweetness, all the good polysaccharides, and all the good deliciousness is going to be in that root. Now, when it gets up to here, you go get this root. It is going to be fibrous, tough, and bland. Okay, this is not the time you want to be harvesting a burdock root. Now, if you're going to be harvesting a burdock root, you better have a digging tool because that root is very, very long. It can be up to like 3 feet. Single taproot down. You're not going to be just pulling this thing up. It is going to take some effort, but it is an effort that is worth it because it is extremely delicious. And actually, I should go out and dig mine up before it grows. I brought some here to plant it in my yard for said purpose. So we saw the first year we're going to have that rosette growing around. If it's the greater burdock, you're going to have quite a spread there. We're talking like 3 feet across. This is a huge plant. These leaves are incredibly huge. If you look at my ebook, I think there's a picture of my hand, and I mean, just looking at this one in the left-hand side here in the second year, This literally is like well over a foot. This thing is huge. I mean, you can make a sandwich, like wrap out of this thing and carry it around, or make a pouch, collect some berries. You can use this for a lot of things. It is safe for those purposes. It's a little fuzzy, but you can still eat these leaves. They're not too bad. And some of the species are a little less fuzzy, so it's whatever your palatability taste is. You might see some of the burdocks that have white flowers. You might see purple. White is not as common, but it is actually growing in Washington, D.C. So you will see it there. Well, maybe you will. Anyway, this can get from 2 to 7 feet. Again, low growing in the first year. It's going to bolt up in the second year. Depending on what species it is, it's going to depend how big it gets. Obviously, the growing conditions as well. Now, this one is a really good one because you can use basically all parts of this one. Now, the taproot, end of the first year, ideal. If it's survival situation, you got to take what you can get. But you can eat that thing raw. You can julienne it. It's a great way to consume that root. Just slice it up like you would to a stir fry. Add it to your goods. It has a lot of cool flavor to it. You can also chop it up and make a tea out of it too. It's very delicious. And juice, blend it, roast, saute it, whatever you'd like to do with it. The immature flower stalks, you can peel the stalk, eat raw, juice it, steam it, boil it in salt water, give it a little bit of flavor. The leaves, juice, blended, steamed, makes a great wrap for cooking fish or to use as a plate in the wild. Collect, your berries, however you want to do it. Antioxidant, antibacterial, anti-inflammatory. The leaves, you can use them as a poultice or wash. Dry skin, acne, psoriasis, minor burns, eczema. The root is a powerful diaphoretic. It induces sweating, and it is blood purifying. It supports the liver and the kidney, and it helps with gout. The thing, too, is it also has been shown to help with blood sugar management. So if you are on somebody with those type of things, you need to keep this plant in mind that you want to talk to a doctor about, because any of the plants that are going to help like lower your blood sugar, and if you're taking insulin, could be a problem. It is very detoxifying. It's part of the Essiac tea blend with slippery elm, sheep sorrel, and a rhubarb. Sometimes people use Indian rhubarb. Some people use turkey rhubarb. Anyway, that is a medicinal plant that is used for, things outside the scope of this talk, but definitely check into it. It's an interesting one. Brambles is another common one that we need to be aware of because we can actually eat this in the spring before the berries come on. So that is something to keep in mind. And the fact, things like blackberry, highly astringent. So if we do encounter Giardia or Cryptosporidium, we can make a tea out of that, and that will help, counteract diarrhea or other things of that nature. No, we are looking at the genus here that's going to include blackberries, raspberries, the wineberries, which is also known as the Japanese raspberry, and the dewberry that we'll talk about. And the area that we're going to be using is the berries and the leaves, and also the shoots of the blackberry as well is something that can be consumed. So we are looking at plants that are in the rose family, so it's very common to see 5 petals on these beautiful flowers. The blackberries are a little kind of shaggy in their appearance, but they're still absolutely beautiful. And these young shoots of the blackberries, you can consume, and chop them up and cook them, or you can make tea out of them. And the young leaves you can eat as a salad as well. They're much more tender than you would find with the raspberries. Those are going to be thicker and kind of fuzzier, not so good, but you can make a nice tea out of those. Raspberry leaf tea is used for a lot of medicinal purposes, especially dealing with women issues. You can check more into that. And of course we have the berries, but those are going to come a little bit later. When we're dealing with the berries, the blackberries are going to come on after the raspberries. So you can kind of time it out and, be foraging for berries all summer long, because the blueberries and things like that are going to be, and the huckleberries are going to be earlier, into like early June-ish. And then the raspberries, and then the wineberries, and then the blackberries. You can, get your a lot of berries going on this summer. So as we see with the black raspberry, the flower is a little more, less erratic in its shape, a little more orderly than you're necessarily going to find with the black thing. But it doesn't matter. It's just, getting familiar with the differences. Technically, if you want to get technical, these are not berries. These are aggregate fruit. They call them drupes. But it does not really matter for our purposes. And when we're dealing with the black raspberry, when we flip that leaf on the other side, you're going to see white is. And that's how you're going to tell it apart from the blackberry. But again, it doesn't really matter in a lot of ways. The other way to tell it apart is when we're looking at here, when this raspberry comes off, it leaves this here, and there's going to be a hole in here, a divot. Now, when you pull blackberries, they're going to pull right off here at the stem, and you're going to have a little stem. So they're not going to have that divot. So that's just if you want to learn more about telling the difference between them. Now, what we have here is the Japanese, raspberry, the wine raspberry, the Japanese wineberry, however you want to call it. It is an invasive. It is non-native. Please eat this one. It is absolutely my favorite, actually, out of all of them. And quite delicious. And you'll see it growing all over the Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. area. And quite a interesting one, whereas we're going to look at the canes of all of them to tell the difference, but you're going to see hairs all over this one, along with the characteristic thorns that you would expect with the raspberries and the blackberries. We are going to look at a raspberry, though, that doesn't have the thorns in a moment, though, so you might encounter that. But this is actually, it's one of the, it's so delicious, and this is going to have the divot in it, just like you would see with the black raspberry, the red raspberries. This is just a look at the canes that are different. As you can see, it's going to be like kind of a purpley red for the blackberry. There's going to be no white outer coating on it. It's a little, seems more woody than you're going to see with the black raspberry. But again, it's just for differentiating purposes. This whiteness is going to, if you rub it, it will come off. And here we have just all these hairs all over it, and the thorns are going to be on all of them. This one doesn't seem to have any, but it really does. It just, I didn't get any in that picture. Now this just shows some of the differences. You're going to have all these little stems off of these berry. As you can see, each one of these is technically a berry, so it's an aggregate fruit. And the same thing with the raspberries. So this is what you're going to see on the inside of the raspberries, that divot. And here you have black raspberries as well. And that is either an unripe one or something like that. Pulling that off just to see it. Anyway, the fruit, of course, is edible June through September, depending on which one. You had the raw jelly, teas, cold drinks, young shoots, blackberries in the spring, added to salads, juice blending. The leaves, late spring to early summer. Once they get old, do not consume them. Leave them alone. You can make tea, add it to salad. Flowers, you can eat those April to June. Add them to your salad. We talked about the leaves being astringent and effective in treating diarrhea and dysentery, stomach pain, alleviate menstrual cramps, especially when you're dealing with the raspberry leaf. And it also helps soothe mouth, sore throats. The roots you can make into a tincture, and is a blood tonic for boils, purifying, and it's astringent like as the leaves are. And you can make a wash out of the leaves for sores, ulcers, and boils. You might see a low-growing thing that looks like a blackberry. It is a dewberry. It is not a blackberry that has failed to achieve its, full potential. It's actually just a different species in that genus. You can, of course, eat this. No problem at all. And you might see a few different types. I know there's one in the south. Saw one in Florida when I was down there last year. And then you might encounter the purple flowered raspberry or the flowering raspberry. It's absolutely a beautiful one. It's going to have maple-like leaves that don't look like that in appearance, and it has no thorns, but what it has is sticky hairs all up and down it, as you can see here. And this one is, it's quite delicious. It's a little drier than the other ones, and it doesn't hold up so well. Like, I just eat it on the go. As far as the other ones, I collect like the wine berries, and I'll freeze them through, for use throughout the winter. This one I just eat on the go. Plus, there's not as much of this one as well. And, I'm sure other animals like to eat it. But it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, so you might see it, if you're out and about and wonder if you can eat it. And the answer is yes. So this protects itself from the berries getting eaten. As you can see, it has quite a divot there. And then what's left is this, So you just get this little kind of flimsy disc, if you will. Kind of like the salmon berry if you were out west. But the berries are what you would eat, because it has the thornless stems with sticky reddish hairs. And anyway, it's very delicious, and you can use the leaves like a natural toilet paper, so that's a good one to know about. And, we do have, the leaves can be used as a poultice to treat acne. The leaves can be dried in powder to treat wounds and burns. And, of course, it's high in vitamin C and vitamin A, just like a lot of things would be. But it's a good one. Next up, we have chicory, which is quite a beautiful plant. And if you're familiar with New Orleans coffee, they use chicory root in that. And that's where they're getting it from, is from this. And so if you do get down to New Orleans, definitely try some of that out, or maybe mix some of this with your coffee and you can make some New Orleans style coffee at home. So they call this cornflower. It is not a cornflower. It's just because it looks like cornflower blue. Just like, on Tuesdays, maybe you might wear a cornflower blue tie. Might get that reference or not. Anyway, they call this suckery as well, especially in other regions that not so common around here. Some people call it bachelor's buttons and a wild endive or endive, but it is not the kind you would find at a store. A little bit different, but just some different names colloquially. And you're going to have some early growth. It has like some dandelion style leaves on it, except for it's going to have hair. It's going to have hair going out of those stems. Still doesn't make it unpalatable. One thing to note here in this picture, what do we got growing here? Got some poison ivy growing with it. So be careful. I clearly am not very careful, but please be more careful than me. Anyway, chicory is going to be, grow to be a couple feet tall. You're going to have flowers growing up the stalks. And with respect to chicory and the leaves, it's the best time to get them is before the flower. What you want to see in the spring is you want to see the dead growth from last year. Then you know that at that base is some chicory leaves growing. It's a biennial, could be listed as a perennial. There's some mixed feelings on that, or mixed beliefs. And anyway, the leaves in the spring, juice blended in smoothies, steamed, sauteed, eaten raw as a salad green, or replacement for lettuce on sandwiches. In the summer, you can eat the flowers. They're not as delicious as dandelion flowers, but they are really cool and really pretty. So they do add a little bit of boost to your food, and they do add some interesting colors to your food as well. If you put them in your like gazpacho or your salads, just a little bit of flavor for your eyes as well. And the roots, that's where you really want to get those fall through early spring, like we talked about. Roasted and ground as a non-caffeine coffee substitute. And you can dry and ground it as a flower extender as well. Of course, that would be roasting it. You definitely want to just dry it and do it a little bit differently. The root is anti-parasitic, which makes sense. Things that grow in the ground have to have natural compounds in it to keep worms from eating it. So it does, those medicinal benefits do convey to us if we eat that. It's mildly sedating, so you're not going to get any stimulating effects like you would with like a coffee or something like that. There is no caffeine. It's a nerve tonic. They call those nervines. It's mildly laxative, diuretic, high in inulin, and it serves as a prebiotic. So we have little microbes and little things eating things in our intestinal tract, and we need to feed them. So a prebiotic is going to serve as food for our probiotics. Okay? And so the leaves, they're bitter. They help stimulate the liver to aid in digestion and detoxification. The leaves and the roots, they can use as a poultice to treat skin issues, including cuts, insect bites, and bruises. These are important to know because if we're out in the wild, we might not have access to a doctor as quick as we would like. So this is the conclusion of part 1. I really do appreciate your time and attention. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me. And also, I just want to note on the black and white illustrations that are in this presentation, they were obtained from the USDA. You can go out to the USDA plants database. I will do a video on that because it is a great resource to check native status, to check different things about the plant, whether it's an annual, biennial, or perennial, because you get a lot of mixed information. I do have a lot of faith in the USDA and that they are doing great work. And they do have distribution maps out there that you can check to see if things are growing in your area. They also have where you can choose the state and it'll kind of narrow it down. So there's a lot of filters you can use and kind of get an idea of what's out there. It's not going to talk about whether things are edible, medicinal, or poisonous, but you can get the illustrations are in the public domain. You can also check out some of the images that they have so you can check to see if your identification is correct with what they have as well. So it's really nice. The colored illustration, they're in the public domain. Those were done usually about in the 1800s, sometimes in the 1700s. They did great work, and you can get those. And there's lots of great books on botany and just amazing work. Very thankful for the great artists and botanists throughout the centuries that have really made our lives in the 21st century a lot easier. So, and all plants were photographed in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or Washington, D.C., unless otherwise noted, and I would have been the person taking the pictures unless they were noted to be sourced from the public domain or from, like, Wiki Commons. So, anyway, just peace and love, everybody. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.